All right, everyone. All right. Long story short, I forgot to hit record, so I'm doing this intro all over. And then I also forgot which episode we were on last episode. So it's week 5 now. It wasn't week 5 last week. And instead of Bailey and Meredith, they're next week. This week we have Merritt and Kaitlyn talking, and they're going to talk about advanced baseball progression. So not necessarily return to sports testing, but let's say you're past that phase and you're ready to get back into throwing. They're going to talk about other things you can do beyond just hand them a little sheet that says, do these throws however often per week for this distance. So at this point, I'm going to make Merritt a host, and you should be good to share. And thank you too for joining. I know Kaitlyn, because I work with you, you just got out of work, and Merritt in the middle of spring. So appreciate you guys all for being here.
Sweet. Thank you. Thank you, Vin, for having us on here. Hold on one second. So thanks for having us. I'm really excited to get to do this. Thanks for everyone for coming on here, and let's get started. So this is Baseball and Progressions. They've passed all your tests, and now what? So first of all, my name is Merritt Walker. I'm a PT, and this is Kaitlyn Schlueter here. And we've actually had very similar paths, and we've actually crossed paths a lot during our time as PTs. So we actually both grew up in the Bay Area, north of San Francisco. And although we went to different places for undergrad, we both ended up at Duke, go Blue Devils.
And, Devils.
And then from there, we went to different residencies. Kaitlyn was in Ohio, I was in Boston, and then we're slowly making our way back west, and now we're both working in baseball in some capacity. So that's kind of a little bit about us. And just to give you more info on me now, so I'm currently the minor league PT for the Arizona Diamondbacks. And so my role basically includes anything PT, anything rehab within the minor league organization, and then our long-term major league rehabbers as well. And I always like sharing this, and this is something I share with basically anyone with our organization. I just think this is something that we try to embody these values, and they're important to us. And I just wanted to share it with everyone here. And whenever we're looking at hires or anything like that, we want to make sure they have these kind of values as well. And so I just wanted to share that before moving on to my partner in crime, Kaitlyn.
That's me. So just a little bit about my background and coming to this talk today. So I'm a staff clinician PT out with Samaritan Athletic Medicine. I help head up our sports residency program out here. And then my interaction with both Oregon State's baseball and softball programs is kind of where my role as a rehab specialist comes into play. So that is the lens at which I am coming at this talk today.
And no, we do not have any disclosures. And so this is more of just I love the laugh. This is more of just a typical rehab plan. I know this isn't everything. This is just thinking general terms. We want to control pain, restore range of motion, improve strength, initiate sport-specific activities before moving on to return to sport. And I just kind of want to highlight that in-between phase right here between initiating sport-specific activities and return to sport. So that's basically the majority of where our talk's going to be about. And I think there's just a huge gap right in this area here, and where there's so much variability and there's a lot less evidence and a lot less consistency. So that's kind of something I like, because there's more variation in practice here. Unfortunately, with more variation in practice, I PubMed return to hitting, and unfortunately, there were only 2 articles that actually talked about a return to hitting progression. So this was kind of my reaction. It's not the best. We can do better, but we're going to go improve from there. So key takeaways on progression. Starting out with progressions, I think communication is the most important thing you can have. It's key. It's number 1 with anything you do. And that kind of ties into the next 2. You want to know your athlete, you want to know your coaches, because you want to be able to talk with them and understand exactly what they're going through and exactly how they're feeling, because athletes are going to know their bodies better than we are, and coaches are going to know how these athletes are supposed to perform and how they're supposed to train better than we are. And so at the same time, you can also trust your eyes. I think it's important to be confident in your own abilities. And if something doesn't look right, that's where tying back to communication is so important. I've had so many times when I've said, you know what, I don't know if this looks right. What do you think? Talking to one of our coaches, and they've kind of had the same ideas of, you know what, like it didn't look right to me. I was going to ask you, like, let's have a conversation with the athlete about that. So can't emphasize those enough. It's a real team approach with everything that you do. Kaitlyn's going to talk about this, and we're going to talk about this more with limiting variables. We're going to try to do this as much as we can. And it's obviously not something we can do all the time, but if you can try to focus on one piece of that progression at a time, that's great. Knowing your biomechanics, so not just knowing biomechanics in general, but knowing your sport, and basically for us, what baseball entails. So what are the stressors that the body's going to be going through within baseball? And then be prepared to audible. You're going to see calendars that we wrote, and these are progressions that we wrote, and these are not the first drafts, second or third drafts. These are fifth, sixth, seventh. Like, these things go through a lot of work, and sometimes it's not even health related. There's just other things that happen. Life happens. So you got to be prepared to audible in those situations. And so you can't forget that. So starting out with the case study, we have a 21-year-old prospect. He was a shortstop for us, and he had a mechanism injury where he fouled a ball off his foot, and then in that same game, he was hit by a pitch in that foot as well. And so what happened, we had a CT scan, he had a fractured right navicular. And so that was on October 8th. We re-imaged it about a month later, and it showed minimal improvements in healing, unfortunately. And so for us, November is kind of a downtime off season. So he was sent home for the off season, and we gave him really strict guidelines. And so it was important that he followed those guidelines, but he was sent home for that off season to have time to at least rest and recover. And for us, he'd begin his baseball progression in January. And so then going into more details with him, he's a right-handed thrower, but he bats switch. So that means he will hit from the right side of the plate and the left side of the plate. That's also how he had that mechanism of injury where he was able to foul a ball off his foot one at bat and then get hit by a pitch on the inside of his foot in the next at bat. So it's just that. So it's just very unfortunate and not something that you expect to happen, obviously. But because of that, there's also ways to account for some of those variables. And so one of them that we kind of use, this is an Evo shield. And so this is just one of the ways we can account for variables. All it is a pad that we put over and it forms to his foot, because basically we don't want this to ever happen again. And hopefully we progress him well, but with baseball being so unpredictable, we're just not going to let that happen again. So it's also important to know your equipment and what you have available, because for him, this made us feel a lot more confident with him going to the plate and him feel more confident. And so then going on from there, I'm not going to talk too much about the return to sport testing we did go through, but then at the same time, the bigger goal was spring training start. So that's March 1st is when, hey, let's have him ready. And so basically travel and testing, everything he did was the first week of January. And then that leaves, basically he's going to start January 11th with his rehab progression. And then for us, talking to managers, talking to coaches, that's where communication is important again. Like I said, I can't emphasize it enough. That's where we understand, hey, if he wants to be ready for March 1st, let's make sure he has a week of being on that same schedule for that entire week. And so that's why March 22nd is that date there. And so that gives us 6 weeks to get him ready to that exact date. And so basically you're thinking, okay, 6 weeks, he has this foot injury. Now what are we going to kind of do right here? And I think the easiest way to at least fall back on things, Tim Gavitt's done a lot of great research, and this isn't the foundation of our talk at all, but it's just a great starting place. And it's something that we still pay attention to within every rehab progression we make. So it is the foundation of our rehab progressions, but it's not going to be what the talk's all about at the same time. But I do want to mention it because it is very important, and it's important to make sure we don't have any spikes when they go through a rehab progression. And so if you look at this and you see all the numbers, you see everything here, all the terms, you might get a little overwhelmed, and it's a lot going on in this one image, and I totally understand that. But at the same time, I think it's a lot easier if we break it up by baseball activity. So what we have here is the red is going to be the hitting progression, the blue is going to be the throwing progression, the purple is going to be the running progression, and then the green is the defensive progression. And then the same thing going through February. It's a little easier to read and it's a little easier to understand. And so we're going to come back to this slide at the end, but I'm going to kind of go through each one of these categories one at a time so we can get a better idea of what each one of them entails. And so before I even get any further, this is just a nice example. I think when we think of baseball, we automatically think of upper extremity. And so I think we always think we need to get upper extremity, shoulder, all this stuff, but the legs do have a really important part, especially in a swing too. So I think when we talk about hitting progressions, we can't forget about how important the legs are. And there's, looking at some of the research, there's 100 to 150% of body weight is generated through the legs and through the ground. And that's based on where you are in the swing. That just changes a lot. And it's basically a lot of movement is generated through the legs, through the feet, through the hips. And then another great important factor, and something that I thought was a nice, interesting fact really, was that bat exit velocity was correlated with basically the ground reaction force on the back leg here. So as much as we try to say baseball is an upper extremity sport, we need to utilize the legs. And then here's kind of a rough of what our hitting progression looks like. Here's all the terms that we're going to go through, and this is kind of what it looks like. I think it's tough because I don't want to say we have X, Y, Z intensity percentage that we give these guys. I think it's really hard to do that for hitting because you don't want them to go from 50 to 100%. And so each one of these activities that I'm going to go through kind of builds in and of itself to higher intensity. And then the red is the ones I'm going to go over. The white is velo machine, live BP, game, are things that I'm not going to talk about, but were important in our normal rehab progression. I'll mention the velo machine. For us, it's more important because you're never going to see 90, 95 plus mile an hour fastball normally unless you're in a game situation. So for guys, it gives them an idea. All it is a pitching machine that we crank up to high speed, so they're able to get used to swinging at high intensity with high velocity pitches coming at them. And so that's what that is. And I'm just going to go through starting with dry swings here. So this is literally how a dry swing looks. I actually love this GIF as an example of just, that's all it is. It's a casual swing. All we're trying to do is get them used to swinging again and see how it feels. We're not trying to do anything more than that, really. Moving on to tees. Hopefully it goes better than this kid right here. I'd hope so, at least where I am, that they don't have stuff like this happening. So that's the goal, that they don't do this. But the importance of tees is it allows them to actually feel impact of the bat hitting a ball for the first time too. And they're able to actually see where that ball goes. So it's nice for them to get a little extra cueing and external validation of where they're hitting the ball to. And then moving on to flips, I know I showed this video already, but basically what flips are is all it is an underhand toss given by a coach or one of us even. And basically it's a casual swing. They're able to actually react to where that pitch is thrown a little better. And it's basically it's the first step of getting them back to a higher intensity of swinging. Moving on to cage BP right here. So we have one of our pitching coaches here, and all he's doing, or one of our hitting coaches, and all he's doing is he's the guy that's giving them, he's the guy throwing the balls for our batter right here. And so this is the first time they're able to actually track a ball overhand as well. That's something that you need to make sure they're comfortable with, and you need to make sure they feel okay about. So that's just a nice little gradual progression of intensity here as well. Field BP. I really like this video here of showing, because anytime you move them onto a field, they have a tangible goal of trying to hit the ball over the fence. And so no matter what you do, and no matter what you try to think like, oh, this isn't going to be as intense, no matter what, they're going to swing harder because they actually have something they can shoot for. In a cage, the back of the net's about the same distance in every cage they're going to. When you get to these fences, that's when people have a lot more fun, and they're going to try to hit it over. So I just think it's really important that you want to make sure you hit those steps before you get them on the field, because whether you like it or not, they're going to swing harder at this stage. I'm not going to spend too much time on throwing progressions. I think it's just important to note that just like everything, we go through a gradual progression of increasing that distance. And then the last two really are the most important for me. So the ground balls at second base and the ground balls at shortstop. So for him, we just want to make sure that he's comfortable not only being able to build up his arm strength, but then once he gets to that point, he can start throwing, I guess, with more intensity. And starting at second base is a lot easier and a lot closer than starting at shortstop. And so while it doesn't seem like second base is very far away and they can kind of ease it in there. They're not going to. Same kind of factors come into play. They're on a field again. They want to throw hard, and that's basically what they're going to do. And so this is a video I wanted to show. I think when we talk about defensive progressions, we talk about, okay, like let's just make sure they take ground balls and go from there. I just wanted to show this to give everyone an idea of how much his feet are moving throughout a defensive and ground ball drill. So every ball is going a different way, and everything he's doing, he's constantly changing direction, he's constantly cutting, and he's constantly reacting, planting, and getting ready for the next ball that's coming his way. And so I just thought this was really important, because if you were to just give him basically a progression of, hey, take grounders outside, you really need to make sure you go through steps to make sure he's comfortable, especially for a guy coming off a foot injury like this right here. It's really important that he's comfortable and he's able to handle the cutting and the stopping that this is going to entail. And so that's why I at least wanted to touch on this defensive progression right here. We start out kneeling to eliminate all weight bearing together, and then standing ground balls without moving. So basically they're standing still. They're not able to go outside of their little radius that they have. And that's really important when we're trying to build everything up, because we're able to kind of monitor their workload and how much impact they're putting through that foot at the time. The video that I showed was standing ground balls with no throw. And so even though it's no throw, there's a lot of movement going on from there. And so there's a lot going on. There's a lot of cutting. And so it's important to note that this is a progression that needs to be taken with a guy with a foot injury, and you need to make sure that they're comfortable and confident to be able to take ground balls standing up and be able to react to wherever that ball is going. And then normal ground balls from second, normal ground balls from shortstop. It's the same thing that I touched with throwing progression. It's important that you start out at second base, let them get used to that before moving on to farther away from shortstop. And then running progression for him was actually one of the bigger things, especially being a foot injury and especially being a guy like him. So he was the guy who steals bases. He's a shortstop. He's a fast base runner. So running progression was really important for him. And this is kind of the progression that we take. For sake of time, I'm not going to mention too much on the running mechanics and strider side of it, but it's important to note that there are a lot of different ways that we need to build them up so that they're able to get to these steps. And so making sure they get comfortable absorbing impact through that foot again, being able to tolerate it, and then being able to gradually build up that volume for him is so important. So those steps are very important before I get into the ones I'm going to talk to with sprints and everything else. And moving on to sprints, the next two we go to are sprints and sprints with decel. And so sprints are pretty simple. We let them judge that percentage. Sometimes we'll give them a percentage, but a lot of the time they understand like, okay, I can start building up that percentage a little higher. And I think it's important that they're able to tolerate this before moving on to the next one, because sprints with decel basically will let them sprint around 30 to 40 yards. And then their goal is to decelerate for the last 5 yards at first. And then obviously we want to make that number smaller and smaller, but baseball is such a sport of changing direction and being able to cut and stop on a dime that you really need to make sure that they're able to accomplish this before getting them on a field for normal game routine, because this is something that happens a lot with them and they need to be able to feel comfortable and be able to do it constantly. And then arcs is kind of our introduction before we get to them running around bases. What I like about it is it's not as intense as running bases and you don't have to take as sharp of cuts. The goal is basically introducing them getting used to running around a base path without having to take those sharp cuts or stopping or anything like that. It's also a really great way to build volume, because arc is actually going to be longer than any base path that you're going to go through. So you're going to be able to build volume during this while also introducing to them being able to cut and round bases for the first time. And that kind of leads into the next one here with bases. And these numbers right here, so 180, 210, 240, 270, those are in yards. So for anyone who didn't know, a base is 90 feet away. And so that's about 30 yards. So when we start out with bases, we kind of use that or use those numbers as our baseline of where we want to go with it. And so 180 yards is a great example of using. So if you want to go the first day, basically what that's going to be is just 6 bases going straight home to first. and that would be 180 yards. Okay, day one, good. Or if, say, you're feeling confident he's doing a good job, let's work on rounding bases. That would be 4 bases going home to first and then 1 going first to second kind of thing. And then all we're doing is building volume after that and letting them get used to what it's going to be like basically in a game, and building this type of volume for them on bases, what I like to think about. And it's really, we want to be prepared for what is the worst case scenario that can happen. We don't want it to happen, but we want to be prepared. So if the worst case scenario were to happen, we're ready for it. And so these are actually videos I took. I'm sorry for the video quality. This is, it was taken on Android, I think. So that's probably why. Basically what he's doing here is reacting to my verbal cues of saying switch. So it's giving him something else to focus on while he's getting used to cutting again. It's a great way because especially in baseball, everything we're doing is so reactionary that we want to make sure that they can tolerate the reactions and also the cutting at the same time. If we just focused on the cutting, it'd be a little tougher for them. So it's important that they need to, or it'd be a little easier for them. We need to make sure that they can react to everything. And this is the kind of worst case scenario I'm talking about. I think about the worst thing that can happen is he's in a pickle for a very long time. And while it probably is never going to happen this long, the goal of this is to make sure he can stop, cut, turn around, and be able to go back and forth confidently and comfortably. And obviously he's going to get fatigued. So it's also a nice conditioning thing. And it's almost like a game. It's really fun getting to do stuff like this with them and just see how long they can last. And they have a lot of fun with it too. And so I think that's a good final as we're kind of building up the running progression, whether it be arcs, bases, sprints with decel. We're also adding in changing of direction like this because it's really important to be able to be confident changing direction and not only do that, but also be able to react to what's going on, because everything in baseball is a game of reaction. That's all we're trying to do. And it's the most unpredictable sport that I can think of. So you have to be prepared for it. And that really kind of ties back into everything here. What we're trying to do with all the variables that come up here is basically be able to limit as much as we can if we're able to. And so a good example is actually on the first and the second right here. So the day that he throws lighter catch at 90 feet, we're going to have him take ground balls and throw from second base. So he's getting his throws in still, working on his upper extremity strength. Whereas on Tuesday, when he throws a little longer to 120, he's not going to throw that day. So we're kind of going back and forth with the defensive progression and the throwing. And the same thing can be said for the 8th and 9th. So the day that he's doing on the 9th field BP, he's going to be doing his sprints instead of focusing on the 8th where he's doing arcs. So the day he's doing less batting on the 8th, he's going to be doing more running. And then on the 9th, he's going to be doing more batting and focus on less running. So all it is if you can focus on being able to monitor those variables and go from there, really. Obviously, things don't work out that way every time. Sometimes things are going to have to go up both at the same time. But if you can track it like that, it's a really good starting point. And then with anything, you just got to be ready. This is a great example of if you can't get the ball out of your glove, you got to react, you got to adapt and be able to make it work. And that's basically what they did right here. So whatever happens, just be ready because there's a lot of things that could happen in baseball, to say the least. And then let's hope that I can figure out how to do this.
You can do it. You can do it.
I think I got it. Did it work?
I think so. Give me 1 second. Oh, for the love of God. See, you can figure it out, but can I figure it out is the real question. Okay. People see that okay?
You're good.
Fantastic. Okay, so thanks, Merritt. That was spectacular as always, and really did a nice job kind of teeing me up for this piece of the case example. And yes, that was in fact a baseball pun. So I'm again coming at this from the angle of the collegiate level. And so I'm also going to use a case to kind of talk through similar progressions. And we're going to talk now upper extremity injury versus lower extremity. So kind of give a little bit of a parallel there and point out some key differences. So just a little bit of background. We will not spend much time here at all, but just to kind of carry this through what we chat about. This guy is a second base player. His initial mechanism of injury was diving out on a left outstretched arm, shoulder dislocation, able to relocate in the dugout, and moving forward, his main complaint was that posterior left shoulder discomfort. He did have a previous history of a surgical labral repair about a year ago, so pre-COVID season, and our diagnostic imaging to kind of confirm what was going on. No re-injury to the labrum, and our biggest concerns here that I just wanted to point out as far as why we structured things the way that we structured as far as his progressions back to sport were more of these bony pathologies. So a lot of our timelines circle around kind of that bony tissue healing time. Again, this is player metrics just so we know it. He throws right-handed, bats left-handed, which again is going to come into play in some of our progressions. Just to check the boxes, we did perform all of his upper extremity return to sport testing. Again, not the point of this talk, but pieces that we did kind of objectively check some boxes before we jump into some of these more sport-specific progressions. And then a little bit longer of a timeline. So his goal post-injury and what we're trying to get him back for as far as his expectations and coach's expectations are a summer ball start of June 1st. So the blessing of a COVID season is we have a much bigger roster with a much deeper group of guys. And so even being a scholarship athlete at second base, we had other guys. And so we did have a little bit more wiggle room as far as our timeline. Kind of a similar point that I wanted to make with a calendar. So if this is what we look at as far as the calendar goes, you see physician clearance initially and passing of all our return to sport testing in the upper left. And this is our goal down here in the right. How do we effectively manage kind of that acute chronic workload to set this guy up for both performance success when he returns and a decreased risk of re-injury? And so the way that I like to think about this, and I kind of sat and prepped for this talk and thought about how I wanted to kind of present and share this. I came up with this idea of a progression pie. And so if you think of this pie as looking at volume and or intensity in each of these places, for him specifically, our big areas of progression were going to be hitting, fielding, throwing, and then kind of his strength and conditioning progressions. And so if we dive all the way in and we're like, oh man, like we're going to tackle all of this, we're going to hit it all at once. A lot of that is like way too much, way too soon. And we're going to end up in a bad spot. And again, ideally, we're progressing each of these from either a volume perspective or an intensity perspective in as sequential of a fashion as we can. And for this kid, based on his pathology, throwing was a spot that we focused first and built that volume really quick. Strength and conditioning was kind of consistently there from a workload standpoint with different body regions and progressive focuses. And then fielding and hitting were the pieces that we held him out of the longest, again, based on that bony tissue pathology. So we'll dive into each of these a little bit more here. But so if you look at calendars, again, kind of tried to color code and marry a little bit kind of what Merritt works through with our calendars. And we do things in a really similar way, but we try and set short-term goals. So there's like big short-term targets that we have in here, obviously starting with physician clearance, passing of objective return to sport testing. Again, we did that throw progression initiation pretty early, and then setting these short-term goals along the way to really guide those progressions, then getting into some of these more like middle term goals and trying to find more of a steady state load in some of those early progressions before we go and initiate some of these other pieces, so that when we go to start to build volume or intensity or introduce a new sport specific activity, we're not causing some of these acute workload spikes. And then again, finally saving some of our more live drills, live game situations closer for the end, so that from a load, performance, and confidence perspective, we're hopefully setting himself up for success to hit that summer ball start date. So looking at throwing, for him, this was the first place that we built that volume in our little pie here on the right. His pathology was left-sided, so that right hand, because he's right hand dominant as a thrower, was not really directly involved in that pathology. Pulling from buckets to throw, really not even using that left side, was an easy place to start, and that didn't necessarily require catching right away. That non-throwing arm, as it's involved in throws, is important to consider depending on pathology. For him specifically, this was not something that we considered, but I did want to mention it here, just based on, players you may see and interact with that may have pathologies that limit some of these motions. So if you think of that front side arm when you throw, it is more of that pull supination component. And then if you're playing some sort of catch, there is that reactive catching, reactive reaching piece that I think you do want to consider in education of athletes and coaches, and what maybe they can tolerate, or maybe again, you want to maintain some volume and steady state on a throwing arm, but maybe pull from a bucket. So there's no catching necessarily involved. So for this kid, the throwing progression again was pretty basic. The easiest way that we have to progress intensity is using volume right off the bat, because he's not a pitcher and we're not really quite as concerned with velocity. We're more concerned with distance and power and getting the ball there. So progress distance first, and then increase that position specific intensity from second base, throwing to different spots, calling out plays, mock situations, etc. And then we did progress left upper extremity throwing just from a plyometric perspective. So I did want to mention that here. We didn't totally neglect the need to throw. Again, one, as Merritt points out, the ability to be reactive and call an audible. Maybe in a game he's going to have to throw with his left side. So these are pieces that we work through progressively, kind of bilateral double arm plyos, making sure that that reactive component is there. And then we did do some single arm work. We like to start oftentimes with more of those reverse tosses, kind of isolated ER, reverse D2 patterns, either with a teammate against a wall, and then played with progressions of flicking balls, forward toss, and being able to throw. Again, no concern for volume there, but if he needs to throw a ball with his left hand, is that confidence there and is that load capacity there? So that was where we kind of built volume first. From a strength and conditioning perspective, that was kind of there consistently throughout. And the way we progressed his overall training capacity, we did kind of shut him down at his left upper extremity for a full 4 weeks, just to kind of promote some of that bony tissue healing, and really avoided those end range ER positions just based on the location of that pathology until we cleared him, which we just recently did. And so our big focus early on with his strength and conditioning was, again, maintaining that kind of chronic workload through lower body power development, and had kind of a big motor control focus with some of his lumbopelvic dissociation, core control, power development, so that once we get him to a point where we're starting to reintroduce things like hitting and fielding, we are offloading his upper extremity from an injury risk standpoint as much as we can, and putting him in a spot from a performance standpoint where his lower body is contributing to that as much as possible. And then our earliest progression in the weight room for him from an upper extremity standpoint, again, pathology based, with a history of labral pathology and then some of those bony pathologies, making sure he can tolerate that kind of distraction component and kind of a heavy grip focus with some of the research we know about cuff activation with just grip period. Are we giving him stability and then building that power from there? So strength and conditioning progressions, pretty basic, but just wanted to mention that that wasn't really something we shut him down from outside of upper body pieces for about 4 weeks, and then gradually worked into those progressions based on the pathology that he came to us with. The two big places that we really wanted to be intentional about progressions with him, especially from an upper extremity component and his specific pathology, were fielding and hitting. Fielding is something we started with him first. And the two big pieces here were his kind of glove work and then his diving. So the goal here with some of these progressions, again, kind of how Merritt explained, you don't necessarily increase intensity based on like speed of throwing. I'm not giving him percentages of effort here. The activities and how we progress the activities kind of do this themselves. So kind of in a similar way, we started with knee drills, not because it was a lower extremity injury, but more because it limited variables and need to react. So essentially we took his legs out of it and kind of worked just in his full arc of motion on reactivity first, and then progressed to kind of that ground ball, fly ball progression, just to increase that cognitive load for him. And then backhand drills, we did intentionally throw in there for him, again, just based on location of pathology and how we wanted to load through more the posterior side of his shoulder, to increase kind of tissue capacity, make sure from a reactivity standpoint, that's not something that's going to flare him once we get back to kind of full practice, full game, full go. And then line drives, of course, being kind of one of the most heavy, intensive, reactive components from a fielding standpoint. The other piece, fielding for him, that we really are working on being intentional about, is the diving piece. And this is kind of twofold. One, his mechanism of injury was a dive. So there is a kind of psych confidence component that we want to make sure we give him both a mental capacity and a like functional tissue capacity to handle. And then working into some of that progression of closed chain stability, closed chain reactive work, and kind of a plyo work. So we actually started some of these progressions in the weight room and then tried to pull those progressions and those positions into drills that we were doing on the field and then eventually into live play. So we kind of started with a fall from knees, so thinking almost like a Nordic hamstring kind of curl position, but with more of a focus on the plyo upper extremity component, and then progress that into doing that from standing. So first of all, is he comfortable doing it? Is something when you get into some of these teams, you know these guys, and so you can tell when they hate it. So making sure we're progressing from a confidence standpoint too. But this is a spot, just understanding again, to Merritt's point, the demands of the sport, the demands of the position, and maybe not a worst case scenario, but this is a position that this kid is going to find himself in based on his role on this team. So this is a spot, again, based on injury, based on location of pathology, and based on tissue demands to make this move happen through his upper extremity, is something we wanted to be very intentional about. He's actually handling some of the like early pieces of this pretty well. And we'll get into some of that reactive component with him coming up here soon. And then the last place that we are going to progress him, and this is not something that he has started yet, are some of his hitting progressions. So for him, based on how he hits, it's going to be one of the last things that we introduce and just forces through the upper extremity hitting period. It's a lot of heavy load. So based on that pathology, we're choosing to introduce his swing progressions at about 6 weeks. So thinking kind of that bony tissue healing time. If he batted also righty, we probably would have pushed that out another 2, maybe 3 weeks, just based on the mechanics. So if you look here on the right up top here, so this is obviously not him, but this is how he bats. So he bats lefty. So it's that back arm, it's your top hand. So if you look at left shoulder, this is his involved shoulder. If we're thinking kind of tissue stresses through this move, his like history of a labral repair. So any stress with batting left-handed here is kind of that increased loading through that anterior glenohumeral complex as he swings through. And then again, increased distraction forces. So we know distraction forces and labral tissues don't necessarily love each other, mainly on that follow through. And then really the only loading that he's probably going to get through that kind of posterior Hill-Sachs bony pathology here is maybe going to be in the initiation of that acceleration phase of the swing, with a little bit of scapular protraction, and then perhaps a bit of follow through in that like crossbody adducted position. versus if he were to bat lefty. If you look at kind of the difference in demand on left upper extremity here, if that is his lead arm, this kind of shows you exactly why we would probably hold him out another 2 weeks if he batted righty. So if his left arm was kind of leading here, again, based specifically on his pathology. So this circles back to some of those takeaways Merritt touched on at the start. You have to know your athlete. You have to know the demands of what they need to get back to, and then you need to know where they're coming back from. So in this loading position, so when he's cocked all the way back here, that's a lot of just cross-body adduction period that stresses that point. And then at ball contact, when he's pulling all the way around like that, that posterior cuff, posterior capsule, posterior joint load is really high. So again, from a tissue healing standpoint and from a gradual progression of capacity and tissue load based on how he swings, we started him at about 6 weeks. If he swung differently, we kind of would have pushed that out. So then the hitting progression itself, pretty boring based on, you know, those 2 articles that exist, but this is generally the progression we go through. Merritt did a nice job kind of showing videos of what all of these look like. But again, once we initiate it, it looks pretty standard, pretty basic. Again, based on how he responds, we can progress volume and intensity within each of these phases. But truthfully, the intensity is going to increase as you kind of go stepwise through this piece. So really all things considered with this kid, start to finish, understanding that underlying theme of acute to chronic workload is super important in kind of deciding what those short-term goals look like. So keeping that piece in mind, and then understanding how some of these athletes' sport-specific tasks relate to their underlying injury and concerns you may have for tissue stress. Hopefully this becomes a lot less intimidating and we can walk away from some of these conversations feeling a little bit more like this and like we have the ability to progress based on kind of taking chunks of that pie and increasing volume and intensity there while we maintain some steady state load in other places. So circling around to some of these takeaways, really what we want you to walk away from this talk with, we boast this all the time. This is nothing that anybody on this call doesn't already know, but communication is key. And then knowing your athlete, know their position, know how they throw, know how they hit, know the demands of that position. From a coach's perspective, know the coach's expectations of that athlete. How important is that athlete to the team? What are some of that coach's short-term, long-term goals as far as games, seasons, and player utility? Trusting your eyes, how do you see that player's biomechanics? And how do those biomechanics relate to what you know to be normal and what you know to be stressful from a tissue component as it relates to that player's injury? And then in terms of limiting variables, have a piece of pie. Consider how you're loading acutely, consider what their load already is. And if there is a space to increase volume, try and increase volume and try and increase intensity and kind of those short-term goal related chunks versus trying to throw it all at them at once, because then we don't know from a tissue reactivity standpoint how they're responding. And then of course, always be prepared to audible, change on the fly, be comfortable enough making 5, 6, 7 iterations of a calendar and coming back to coaches and asking if timelines seem feasible. But that from a case standpoint is all that I had. I know we wanted to leave some time for questions and discussion because like Merritt mentioned in one of his first slides, this is a space where from passing of return to sport testing to full return to performance, there's a lot of variability. So we wanted to use the cases today to kind of outline lower extremity versus upper extremity and demands of baseball on both of those body regions. And we did that kind of pulling on some of these references. And so the references are here for you guys to kind of dive into just as a little bit more of a foundational understanding for some of the theories behind all of the things that we kind of chatted and presented about today. But Let's definitely dive into some questions. I know from a time standpoint, we may have to cut things at some point. So we did put both our emails on here. So if you have cases you want to chat more specifically about, I'm volunteering both of us, like please, please reach out. I know Merritt and I are both happy to do that, but let's kind of chat a little bit here, either about these cases specifically, progressions, cases y'all have. I don't know, Vian, if you had any specific questions that you already had prepped. I feel like you probably do.
I really wish I had something prepared, but I did have questions that just came up as you guys were talking. So let's say we have a high school athlete and you have these plans on the calendars like that. Attention span wise, are you giving it to the athlete, the coach, the athletic trainer, and are you explaining just week by, like, are you just giving a week worth to them? Or are you gonna give them the full plan, just like get the buy-in of you're gonna get here, but this is what you're doing now? How do we present that to someone we don't see every day in the college or pro setting?
I can totally start. And then Merritt, if you've got other thoughts, let me know. So usually if I'm giving something like this to a high school athlete, I am sending them with the full calendar. So if I'm saying, you know, from today to, I don't know, let's say arbitrary 8 weeks from now, and then all I'm putting on that athlete's calendar for that 8 weeks are those like short-term goals. So, you know, 2 weeks from now, we're going to start your throw progression. 4 weeks from now, we're going to start your swing progression. 6 weeks from now, we're going to start your fielding progression. And then I'm giving them the details week to week. So I'm probably copying at least parent and athlete on that. If parent is pretty hands off and wants them just to communicate with their coach, I'll copy athlete and coach on the week to week. But I do not provide that full detail because I think it gets kind of overwhelming. And unless I've got a high school kid with a personality that like needs to know all the details to feel comfortable with it, I'm usually doing short-term goals for the big picture and then the details, volume, intensity wise, week to week.
I had a question kind of following up on that. If you have this like whole calendar laid out for them, how do you address it when plans change, either if like the athlete isn't progressing as quickly as you would expect, or if they're progressing too quickly, like how do you address that?
Merritt, I'll let you start.
I can start with that. I think going back to both Vian's question and yours, like anything and what we do, it really is going to depend, and you really have to know your guy. And so for me, I don't give full calendars out unless it's a guy I know I can trust and I know he trusts me and what's going on. So I actually had a situation come up recently where it kind of depended if he got to go home or do whatever for a little period of time in the off season. And I said, hey, this is where we're at. This is where we want you to be. You've got to be 100% certain on this day that you're going to be ready to go. If you're not, it's not just going to be on you. It's going to be on me too. So if you're leaving here, it's not just about you, it's us. Like we're in this as a team. And so everything I do is about building that collaboration with that athlete. And then it really, things are going to change. Every time I make one, I say, listen, things might change here. We might have to audible, like I said. I will very rarely give them the end date right off the bat. I think that's just a recipe for disaster, and you're guessing at that point, because I'm going to be honest, it never works out perfectly that way, especially with COVID and everything. Like the calendar I showed was very neat. If I counted everything that happened with COVID during this time and all this, like there were days where we were off for 4 days, back on, off, like it was all over the place. So as long as they understand that we're both after the same goal and we both want to accomplish the same thing, they usually have a better idea, for me at least, and they're usually a lot more bought in. So they know what the end goal is, but I try not to give them that exact date. And they know it's probably going to change.
Awesome. Thank you.
Kind of twofold question, baseball and softball not mentioned, but Kaitlyn, you brought in our athletic trainers for softball. How would the progression differ for catchers, especially for softball, if they're throwing from their knees and that's what they want to do? Are you as worried about their lower extremity fitness, we'll call it, or capacity? And how do you go about progressing their throwing volumes based on the torque that just comes from their shoulder alone?
Yeah, I'll hit the softball piece a little bit. So catchers specifically are a fascinating position. Personally, it's my favorite position in both baseball and softball, but don't tell anybody. And I have a softball catcher that I'm actually working with right now. She's coming back from a UCL reconstruction, and so upper extremity load is a huge concern of ours for her. And so our throwing progression, we kind of went through full throw, pretty heavy focus on lower body power there, just from if she ever has the time to get up and hop up and throw down from standing, we want her again to be able to do that. But a lot of our volume, kind of, let's say like 75 to 80% of the way through her return to throw progression was from her knees. So we did a lot of like sliding drills with pads in the training room, sliding drills with pads out on the field, not throwing. And then as her throwing volume kind of tapered off, we kind of eventually ended up marrying the two. So it is definitely something that we build into that progression, again, because it's position specific. It's something that we need to do. We definitely look less at like lower body power development from a throw because she does it so little. However, on the flip side of that, she's a great power hitter. So it is something we focused on, just not in the context of throwing.
How do you guys think about progressing from like week to week? Obviously, it depends how quickly you have to get someone back, but I struggle when I'm trying to figure out exactly how much they can kind of progress in each category. Like, is it like a percentage increase that you're doing, or is it just like a clinical decision based on when they have to get back? Any like tips on that aspect?
I can go first on that. I kind of start backwards. So I always will find out like, hey, what is the day we want them back by? What is the goal? And obviously that's not always going to happen, but I want to have that thought in my head of, okay, that's the end goal. And I always work backwards from that. And usually it doesn't work out perfectly the first time. Then I'm like, okay, that doesn't make sense. I rewrite it. I find a way where we get everything in then. And then that's usually the model that I follow with it. Week to week would be tough. It's just, especially, I guess for our setting, they want to know when they will be back and what the timeline is. So I always have to start from what is the date that we expect them to be back from. But when I start backwards and work back from there, it's a lot easier for me to understand, okay, I've hit this benchmark. Now I've hit that one. I have 3 weeks left. I can stretch this out, do whatever I want there.
Yeah, I would agree. I'll echo the same sentiment. I always work backwards. And so from a week to week standpoint, depending on the time, and again, taking into consideration all of these things, like what is the injury? How much do we need to offload it? And are we okay kind of playing through some pain? Those are all factors that are kind of always going around my mind too. But I think also thinking a little bit about what do you want to spike in that day? And so maybe it is more of like a higher percentage than maybe you would typically be comfortable with, but everything else is at a steady state. And from a reactive soreness wise, muscle fatigue wise, they're doing fine. Those are things that maybe you can spike a little bit more based on where that end goal is and what you've worked back from.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, guys. Going back to the question about the little calendars, how do you go about when the players leave campus or the team during the off season? They go to their own coach or training facility. Are you communicating with the athlete mainly, the coaches over there? Are you figuring out which PT? Are you trying to get all of them together? Or how do you guys navigate that? I know it's not always easy.
So it's a little different for me. We don't really, I'm trying to think, like we'll usually, if they're at the baseball progression, we feel confident with sending them home, I guess. I'm in contact with those guys almost every day. And so I will get videos from them almost every day going through it if they have any questions at that point. So it's constantly going back and forth. And then literally anytime someone throws a bullpen, they send me a video usually. And usually they want to have that video anyways and ask, what do you think? Do you see anything here? Do any of the coaches around here see anything? So a lot of the time I'm constantly communicating just with that player. Depending on where the injury is, yeah, I'm going to have to talk to the PT, talk to the trainer they're with. I always am going to have to talk to them if they're at that part in their injury. But for the most part, I will see most of them during that acute phase of that injury. So the baseball progression might be the part that they could do at home. Reason that happened usually is just because of COVID this year. A lot of the time we're going to have eyes on them almost all year. So it's hard for me to say for sure.
Yeah, at the Oregon State level, most of the time what we will try and do, if they're at a point where we really do feel like as our sports med team, we want to oversee their progression a little bit, like a winter break or a Thanksgiving break or a spring break, we will heavily encourage them to stay in town. If they do not, then the way I have managed that in the past is I'm definitely communicating with whatever sports med provider they're going to be seeing, whether it's an athletic trainer they've worked with in the past, PT, etc. And I'm usually communicating directly with that athlete, unless the athlete is more comfortable having me give that information directly to that provider. We'll usually send kind of like a summary of, maybe where their strength is at, where their progression is at, because most of the time it ends up being pretty short term. We can usually predict closely enough how they're going to respond and react at that point to outline like 7 to 10 days. And that's usually the breaks, unless it's like a summer ball season. So we'll usually try and outline it as specifically as we can. Again, not to step on other providers' toes, but just to kind of give some guidance as far as what we expect that volume to be like.
Thanks, guys. And let's say they're going back to sport. Ideally, in a perfect world, we'd like them to meet all their goals and everything. But say we let them before they pass all the criteria or progressions that we have for them. Do you guys keep those injured players on a specific maintenance program that's different from others, or do they jump back in with performance coach or athletic trainer to do the kind of maintenance and arm care program after they return?
So my goal, I think this is something that's interesting. Basically, if we have a guy come back for rehab, he's flying back. We'll say he's at an affiliate and he flies back to Arizona and he's with us. My goal is to make him as independent as possible with his program before he goes back to that affiliate. Because when they're at an affiliate, there's going to be 25 players for one athletic trainer, one strength coach. And I don't want that athletic trainer to be overworked with what's going on. Our goal is to make sure that, and that's kind of a great time for us too, is we get to rework what they're doing, what their warm up is. And usually when they're in rehab, they're pretty receptive to changes. And so it's a great time to be like, hey, what do you think about this for your warm up or that? And we kind of develop something to make them as independent as possible. And then we have great trainers, we have great strength coaches, and we let them kind of do the rest from there.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that sentiment. We kind of handle it the same way at the college level. The only time that I will kind of have like a chronic rehab kid is if they are just a chronic rehab kid. Like they need more of that like bi-weekly, once a month check-in, just to be like, hey, do we need to modify your movement prep? Like, how are you feeling when you're going in games? Do you feel powerful? Do you feel like you're recovering well? And so that's a role that I've started to play a little bit more. Just honestly, I think is another touch point to kind of validate maybe what the athletic training staff is saying, what the strength and conditioning staff is saying. But usually we try and get to a point where they're feeling really good with their movement prep, really good with their maybe like post-game arm care program. And they are independent in doing that, and then use the athletic training staff for any kind of bumps and bruises that they need along the way.
All right, thank you guys. Does anyone else have any questions? If not, thanks again for spending your, well, we're on the West Coast, so your early evening out here. Thanks for the viewers attending. So now it's going to be officially week 6 next time. And Meredith and Bailey are going to present then, not today. So they're going to talk about electric stimulation and application of that during ACL rehab. Primarily, it might come up with other stuff too. But thanks again. Thanks, Kaitlyn, and thanks, Merritt, for joining us and giving us the talk. And thanks again for everyone attending.